Dead pilot. In December of 2004, a long-haul trucker was on his way to complete a delivery in Washington, D.C. after a quick stop in Winchester, Virginia. The unloading at Winchester took longer than expected, leaving him on the road at around 2 a.m. Driving east on Highway 7, he reached the intersection of Highway 7 and Route 601 near Bloomint at approximately 2:30 a.m. He decided to pull into a closed gas station to check his map in preparation for the upcoming delivery. It was a cold, moonless night with no traffic in sight. As he sat there, a sudden knock on the door startled him. Turning off the interior light to get a better look outside, he rolled down the window and saw a man standing by the truck. The man was dressed in an airline flight crew uniform, sporting 4 stripes on his shoulder epaulets, indicating that he was a captain. What struck the driver as odd was that this man was without a jacket, despite the freezing temperature outside. The man then climbed onto the truck's step, and the trucker noticed a strong smell of kerosene coming from him. Upon closer inspection, he saw the TWA insignia on the man's cap. The man then asked for a lift, with his voice raspy, possibly from the cold. He explained that he was a TWA pilot and needed to get to Dulles Airport for a flight, even offering to pay for the ride. The trucker, feeling kinda on edge about the whole situation, suggested instead to give him a ride to the next open store where he could call a cab. The man agreed, muttering something about descending, which made little sense to the trucker. The trucker instructed the man to go around and get in the truck from the other side. As the man walked around the front of the truck, passing the first light, the trucker noticed something odd, that the man had long sideburns, which were reminiscent of a style from decades past. What happened next left the trucker frozen in disbelief. The man simply vanished. He didn't fade or walk out of sight, he just disappeared. Startled, the trucker jumped out of his cab, flashlight in hand, and searched around the truck and even underneath it. There was still no trace of the man. Continuing his journey to Washington, the incident weighed heavily on his mind. Later, he recalled that TWA had ceased operations over 2 years earlier, which made the whole encounter even stranger. When he returned home, curiosity led him to research what had occurred. What he found was a crazy connection. On December 1st, 1974, a TWA Boeing 727 Flight 514 crashed into Mount Weather, Virginia, less than a mile from where the trucker had encountered the man. The plane had descended too quickly through a cloud cover and slammed into the mountain, killing all 92 people on board. The flight had been diverted to Dulles due to bad weather at Washington National Airport. Miscommunication between the crew and air traffic control, though, led the pilots to descend prematurely, resulting in the fatal crash. The fact that the trucker encountered someone resembling a TWA pilot in an outdated uniform with a dated hairstyle near the crash site almost exactly 30 years later left him pretty freaked out. Though he hesitated to label the experience as a ghostly encounter, the parallels between the mysterious man and the tragic flight were undeniable. Mr. X's story. This event happened to a woman years before the birth of her children, during a time when she was raising 2 young daughters on her own and working as a waitress in downtown Philadelphia. Somehow, she crossed paths with a long-distance truck driver referred to here as Mr. X, though the exact circumstances of their meeting were never fully shared. Despite that, the two fell in love and began planning a future together. Mr. X frequently traveled long routes, and he had one more trip to complete before they could begin working on the details of their new life in Florida. He had given her the number to a truck stop in western North Carolina, a place where he regularly paused after crossing the Smoky Mountains from Tennessee. The night before Mr. X was due to arrive at that truck stop, the woman had a vivid dream. She saw a mountainous area, a place she had never visited or seen before, and in the dream, she watched as a truck descended from the mountains. Suddenly, something went terribly wrong, being that the truck overturned, rolling 3 times. The image was clear, but the woman didn't put much stock in things like premonitions or psychic experiences. Nonetheless, she mentioned the strange dream to her mother before leaving for work. Later that day, around noon, she called the truck stop to check if Mr. X had arrived. The men working there knew her well enough, and in their usual polite manner, they called her Miss Dolly. When she asked about Mr. X, the man on the other end of the line went silent for a moment before telling her to hold on so she could get the owner's zip. In that pause, the woman likely sensed what was coming. When Zip finally got on the line, he shared the devastating news that Mr. X had been in an accident. He had fallen asleep while crossing into North Carolina from Tennessee, and just like in her dream, the truck had rolled 3 times. Though heartbroken, she moved on with her life. But Mr. X and the dream that foreshadowed his tragic fate were never truly forgotten. Years later, there would be an unexpected postscript to the story. The woman's daughter, who had grown up hearing the tale, eventually moved to North Carolina, which was a twist in life she never saw coming. The story from her childhood had faded from her thoughts over time and wasn't something she had ever shared with her own children. One day though, while traveling through the region with her family and a friend, she found herself driving east on I-40 in North Carolina, not far from the Tennessee state line. As she drove, a strange feeling came over her, a sense that she was near the very place where Mr. X's accident had happened so many years ago. She shuddered without thinking. Her son, who was 17 at the time, asked what was wrong. And in that moment, the story of Mr. X and his tragic accident was passed on to the next generation. The Man in a Trench Coat. This story revolves around the experience of a man from a family that has had its share of strange occurrences. The person telling the story grew up believing such events were normal, only realizing later that others didn't experience the same level of unexplained phenomena. One particularly interesting encounter involves the storyteller's uncle, a man who has twice narrowly escaped death, both times claiming to have seen a mysterious figure he now calls his guardian angel. The uncle, who's based in Durban, South Africa, recalls the first time he saw this figure while working as a trucker. On a journey back from the Eastern Cape, a route known for its dangerous cliffs and sharp curves, he was driving on a narrow two-way road. As he drove, something unusual caught his attention in the sky. There was a man walking in the clouds, dressed in a long brown trench coat. The man showed no emotion and continued walking east to west. At first, the uncle dismissed it as a strange trick of his imagination. However, moments after seeing the figure, he almost drove off a cliff at a high speed. He managed to avoid disaster though by crashing his truck into a tree just below the road level. The tree held the truck in place, preventing what should have been a fatal fall. He thought little of the man in the trench coat at the time, focusing instead on how lucky he was to survive. The second encounter with this mysterious figure happened years later in 2001 in the afternoon when the uncle was driving home from his office. Once again, he saw the same man in a trench coat walking in the clouds, heading in the same direction, east to west. This time, however, the man disappeared, and shortly after, his car suffered a mechanical failure. The axis of the hind wheels broke, causing the vehicle to spin uncontrollably into another car. The accident left him critically injured, and his condition was so severe that he nearly lost his life. The cause of the mechanical failure remained a mystery, with the insurance company concluding that the breakage was highly unusual, possibly a factory defect. While he was hospitalized and drifting in and out of consciousness, the uncle kept mumbling about the man in the clouds. His family and doctors thought it was the result of a delirium, but once he recovered, he insisted that he had seen the same man during both the near-fatal accidents. He believes that the figure saved him twice from certain death. The uncle has since referred to this man as his guardian angel, someone who appears only during life-threatening situations. What intrigues the family even more is the fact that both times the man was seen walking in the same direction, from east to west, although the significance of that remains a mystery to them. This strange encounter, while lacking an explanation, has stayed with the family for years, especially because of the uncle's conviction that he should have died both times, and yet he survived. The Barking Man. Many years ago, during a shift known as Meet and Turn, a truck driver was scheduled to meet another driver halfway to exchange a load and continue its journey. The arrangement was routine, and the driver had arrived at an empty lot an hour before the other driver. It was around 3 a.m. and the lot was deserted. With time to spare, he decided to take a quick nap. 10 minutes into his rest, he was abruptly awakened by the sound of a barking dog. At first, he tried to ignore it, but the barking grew louder and closer with each second. The persistent noise made it impossible to sleep, and he began to wonder if the dog was trying to alert him to something, or if it was just a nuisance. Annoyed, he sat up to take a look, and what he saw left him frozen in shock. Just inches away from his window stood a man, about 35 years old. He was large and imposing, but what really terrified the driver was the man's behavior. He was barking. The man's eyes were wide with a crazed look, and he was even frothing at the mouth. The barking then continued, loud and animalistic, as the man stared directly at him through the glass. In that moment, the driver felt a surge of fear, but he managed to remain calm. Without making any sudden movements, he slowly reached down, started the truck, and began to drive away. As the truck moved, the man chased after it, barking wildly as though he were a rabid dog. The driver continued to pull away, watching in disbelief as the man pursued him. Since that day, the driver has never taken another nap on the job. The shoulder walkers. Many years ago, a truck driver frequently made the run from Vancouver to San Francisco, a trip that typically posed no issues. He preferred driving at night when traffic was light, allowing for smoother journeys. However, there was a dark side to driving through the empty highways late at night, things he'd see that defied explanation. UFOs, strange creatures like Bigfoot, and other oddities were often part of the journey. Yet none of those ever terrified him as much as the people he occasionally spotted walking along the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. The first encounter happened on a junior run down south along Highway 5. A woman in a blue summer dress walked along the shoulder under the full moon, completely unbothered by the isolation. The closest civilization was miles away in both directions, and she didn't even glance up as the truck passed her by. The trucker chalked it up to some free spirit wandering in the middle of nowhere, but this was only the beginning. It wasn't actually every night that he'd see these people, but once he noticed them, they always were impossible to ignore. He started seeing them every so often, always at night, always in the most remote stretches of highway. These figures were of different shapes and sizes, men and women, young and old, yet they all had the same disturbing behavior. They walked the white line on the side of the road as if on a predetermined path, never straying from the shoulder. The truckers had a nickname for them, shoulder walkers. For a long time, they were just a strange, creepy part of the job. He'd spot them for a split second as he drove by, never thinking much beyond the oddness of it all. But that changed a few months ago when he encountered a specific elderly woman. It was on a quiet night, just another routine drive, when he saw her. The woman was in a hospital gown, shuffling slowly along the side of the road. Despite feeling creeped out, something about her reminded him of his own grandmother. So, feeling a tug of sympathy, he decided to stop the truck and see if she needed help. Grabbing his flashlight, he stepped out of the cab and walked toward her. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he called out, shining the flashlight toward the figure. There was no response. As she came into view, he was struck by how frail and sickly she appeared up close. Her skin was pale, her hair frizzy and white, and her eyes looked sunken, almost lifeless. But it was the smile on her face, a really wide grin, that unnerved him the most. He took a step back as she continued her slow shuffle toward him, with her hands reaching out like she wanted to touch him. Her fingers wiggled and her mouth opened slightly, but still no words came out. The trucker's heart pounded as he froze, unsure of what to do. The woman, though, kept advancing, with her eyes locked onto his, and when she got close enough, her bony hands reached for his ankles. In a panic, he kicked at her, but her grip was unbelievably strong. Desperately, he kicked again, this time connecting with her face. To his horror, it felt like kicking a solid wall, but the impact was enough to make her release her grip. She continued her slow walk down the shoulder, with her gaze never leaving him, and the trucker scrambled to his feet. He watched as she faded into the darkness, with her shuffling footsteps gradually disappearing into the night. Stunned and terrified, he hurried back to his car and sped away, but not before catching one last glimpse of her in his rearview mirror. Her eyes were still locked onto him, with her lips curled in that same eerie grin. Since that night, he's noticed something different about the shoulder walkers. They all seem to be watching him now, with their eyes following his truck as it passes. Since that day, he no longer stops for them. He's seen plenty more men, women, and even children, but he keeps driving. He doesn't know what would have happened if he hadn't gotten away that night, but he knows one thing for sure, that he won't be taking that chance again. So I turned the lights off. Late one night, a truck driver found himself behind schedule and chose to continue driving to reach his destination. The stretch of road he was on had no street lights, no other vehicles in sight, and the surrounding area felt completely isolated. Suddenly, every light on the truck's dashboard lit up and the engine stalled, leaving him stranded in pitch darkness. The truck wouldn't restart, so he shut everything down and began making phone calls. As he waited for assistance, movement caught his eye just beyond the reach of the truck's hazard lights. After managing to reach someone, the truck driver was told it would take 2 to 3 hours for a mechanic to arrive. Sitting alone in the quiet with only the sound of the hazard lights clicking, he kept his focus on the darkness beyond the windshield. Again, he saw movement, but this time he turned on the high beams. The headlights revealed 3 wolves feasting on what appeared to be a roadkill. When he honked the horn, the wolves turned their head and stared at him, more irritated than frightened. Though the wolves likely posed no direct threat, their presence added to the unease. He turned the lights off then, hoping to calm his nerves. Suddenly, a piercing scream echoed from behind the truck. It sounded like a woman's scream of terror, and before he could react, something slammed into the side of the truck with such force that it rocked the vehicle. Alarmed, the driver turned on every light and blasted the horn, scanning the area through his mirrors and windows. A shadow then darted across the road, vanishing into the darkness. The wolves were now gone, which to him were a sign that something far more dangerous might be nearby. The sounds of thrashing came from the nearby brush, loud enough to suggest something large moving through the trees. The driver gripped the wheel tightly, staring out into the night, waiting for any sign of what was lurking beyond. Eventually, headlights appeared in one of the mirrors as the mechanic arrived, and the noises stopped as the vehicle approached. As the mechanic opened his door to step out, the scream rang out again, and the sound of thrashing in the woods intensified. Startled, the mechanic quickly shut his door and called the driver, panicked and asking what was going on. Neither of them had any idea though what was out there, but both were clearly on edge. The mechanic then made the decision to call the police. 2 state police officers then arrived and lit up the area with bright lights. As they searched the surroundings, the scream echoed 3 times more, each time more distant than the last. The officers, just as baffled as the truck driver and mechanic, offered no explanation for what they had heard. Once the truck was finally repaired, the driver noticed a large indentation on the side of the vehicle about the size of a basketball and positioned roughly 7 feet off the ground. Whatever had slammed into the truck had enough force to leave its mark. Though no one could explain the strange events, one thing was clear, that the driver would never willingly take a nighttime route through that remote area again. A door to the unknown. After a long haul through the city of Melbourne, Ben pulled off for the night in a quiet, remote area just outside the city limits. The darkness that engulfed his truck after turning off the rig's lights was unusually thick, as if the night itself pressed in around him. With no streetlights, cars, or other trucks nearby, the sense of isolation felt palpable, but he was used to the solitude that came with his job. He followed his usual routine, locking the doors, closing the curtains, and scanning the area for anything out of the ordinary. The night seemed calm, so he settled into his bed. However, he couldn't sleep. The cold inside the truck felt strange for a summer night, making him shift uncomfortably, his thoughts wandering to the day ahead. Without warning, the cabin light flickered on, illuminating the small space in a pale yellow glow. Ben sat up and saw the passenger side door of the truck slightly ajar. He knew the door wasn't faulty since the truck was new and in perfect condition. The possibility of an intruder crossed his mind, and he reached for a nearby pole used for tightening belts, ready to defend himself. But as he waited, the silence outside was unnerving. Nothing happened. Gaining enough nerve, Ben climbed out of bed and cautiously checked around the truck. There were no footprints, no other vehicles, and no signs of anyone or anything nearby. It was just him, his truck, and the darkness. After confirming he was alone, he returned to bed, feeling disturbed but eventually falling into a deep, undisturbed sleep. The next morning, Ben woke up and stretched, parting the curtains to look outside. He froze in place though as he took in the sight before him. Right next to his truck, in full view under the daylight, was an old, isolated cemetery. The sight of the gravestones completely terrified him. Not wasting any time, he started the truck, hit the gas, and sped away from that spot, leaving the memory behind. The tall man. In the 90s, John regularly drove across parts of eastern Iowa and western Illinois, often late at night or early in the morning. He was accustomed to stopping at roadside rest areas to grab coffee and take a break before continuing his route. On one particular early morning around 4:30 a.m., he stopped at a rest area in Iowa. The place was nearly deserted, save for a few semi-trucks that appeared to have been parked for some time. John entered the men's room, which was completely empty. After using the facilities, he approached the sink to wash his hands. As he glanced up, he caught movement from the corner of his eye and noticed a tall, thin figure standing about 15 feet away in the entrance. The man was dressed entirely in black, and John was struck by his eyes, which appeared to be pitch black. The figure began giggling softly to himself, and John estimated that he was at least 8 feet tall. John quickly glanced down to grab a paper towel, but when he looked back up, the figure was suddenly inches away from him. He could hear the man's heavy, bubbly breathing, and there was no explanation for how he had crossed the distance so quickly. The figure slowly smiled, revealing sharp, serrated teeth, and began chuckling again, as if he was sizing John up as prey. Terrified, John shouted, "Jesus help me," and bolted for the door. To his surprise, the figure seemed startled, as if John wasn't supposed to be able to move. John then ran to his vehicle, unlocked it in a panic, and slammed the door shut. He locked all the doors, started the vehicle, and sped away. As he drove, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure chasing after the car, moving unnaturally fast. John always believed that whatever he encountered followed him home. Not long after this incident, he was involved in an accident that left him paralyzed. While recovering, a friend came to care for him, bringing their 4-year-old son along. One day, the child was chatting away as young kids do, and the friend asked who he was talking to. The child innocently replied, "He says his name is Bitter. He has long teeth and lives with Mr. John." The friend grabbed their son and left, never returning to John's house after that revelation. A ghost kiss. A year or two ago, a female truck driver had an unusual experience while parked at a truck stop. She was in her truck bunk, sharing the small bed with her Chow Shepherd mixed dog, Rowan. Because Rowan wanted to sleep at the head of the bed, she turned around, placing her head where her feet would usually be. The truck bed, being no larger than a twin size, left little space for the two of them. Late into the night, she was abruptly awakened by the sensation of someone trying to kiss her. She could feel the soft pressure of a tongue between her lips, gently trying to coax her into returning the kiss. Her first instinct was to keep her eyes closed, hoping that if she didn't acknowledge what was happening, it might go away. However, instead of feeling alarmed, she felt a strange familiarity, remembering an old boyfriend who used to do the same thing. Instead of resisting, she decided to kiss back. The kiss was sweet and normal, like a simple exchange. It didn't leave her feeling uncomfortable or violated, just curious. What struck her most was the impossibility of the situation. There was no room for anyone to physically be in the truck with her. The space was too small. Her back was pressed against the wall, with Rowan taking up half of the bed. If there had been another person, they would have to be inside the wall itself. The experience, though strange, wasn't frightening or threatening, just oddly gentle. Even after considering the cramped circumstances of her bunk, she couldn't explain how or why it happened. Ghost soldiers in Texas. One night, while parked in a remote area of Texas, a truck driver and his wife experienced an event that stood out from the years on the road. The night began with an odd noise outside the truck, someone moving near the trailer. The driver got up to investigate, but found nothing in the overwhelming darkness. Moments later, a knock came on the truck door, which startled them both. With no logical explanation for someone being in such a desolate area, the driver grabbed his gun and flashlight to scan the surroundings. Despite shining the light into the dark, there was no one to be seen. Having been robbed before, the driver checked the trailer and the area beneath the truck. He called for his wife to join him outside as he had heard something unusual. Though she was reluctant, she agreed to help. Together, they stood by the trailer, listening intently to distant voices coming from the woods. The voices were too faint to understand, and what made the situation even stranger was that the sounds seemed to move from one side of the road to the other. They speculated that it might be a nearby house with people having a late night gathering, though there were no lights or signs of habitation. Returning to the truck, they sat in the dark for a while, allowing their eyes to adjust to the blackness. It was then that they noticed movement on the road ahead. What appeared to be a group of people were crossing from one side of the bush to the other, roughly 100 feet away. As the driver turned on the headlights to get a better look, the figures vanished, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. Determined to find an explanation, they left the truck with flashlights and walked down the road. The area had been quiet for hours, with no cars or trucks passing by. Reaching the spot where the figures had crossed, they searched for signs of disturbance in the grass, footprints, bent grass, or any indication that someone might be out there. But the grass remained untouched, with no tracks or evidence of any presence. As they stood in confusion, the voices from the woods returned, faint and elusive. Despite hearing the sounds clearly, there were still no lights or signs of any structures nearby. Curiosity got the better of the driver, and he decided to venture into the whole woods to investigate further. His wife, though hesitant, followed him into the thick brush. They walked about 200 yards into the woods, with the voices growing louder but still unintelligible. It was not the sound of a party or casual conversation, but it resembled chanting. The wife, now completely frightened, refused to go any further and urged the driver to turn back. He agreed, as he too felt on edge. As they made their way back toward the road, the truck came into view. While walking along the road's edge, the driver suddenly stopped though and pointed toward the woods, asking if she could see the man standing just ahead. At the edge of the woods, they both saw a figure dressed in what appeared to be a cavalry uniform. Before they could react, the figure faded away, disappearing just as the group of people had done earlier. Without hesitation, they hurried back to the truck, climbing inside and locking the doors behind them. Just moments later, they saw more shadowy figures crossing the road, moving from one side to the other, just as before. These figures, however, lacked any solid form, appearing more like silhouettes than real people. The driver decided it was time to leave and started the truck, driving slowly down the road while both of them kept their eyes wide, watching the strange apparitions fade into the night. For the next hour, they drove in silence, not speaking of what they had seen. Eventually, they found a motel and decided to stop for the night, which was a rare choice for the driver, who usually preferred sleeping in the truck. The next morning, as they prepared to leave, the driver noticed something unusual on the side of the truck. There were numerous handprints on the dusty surface of the trailer, far larger than any normal handprint. Despite having washed the truck just 8 hours earlier, these prints had somehow appeared overnight. They were not fresh either, as dust had already settled on top of them. Given that the previous night had been spent on a dirt road and the truck had been parked on a paved motel lot, the handprints remained an unexplained mystery. The couple then continued their journey to Nevada without discussing the incident further. They even opted for another hotel stay on the way back, which was a rare luxury that felt like a safer option after what they had encountered. Although they never spoke of the event again, the memory of that night in Texas and the strange figures and voices they encountered still remained with him, an experience that couldn't be explained easily. Trucker spots gigantic humanoid creature. In the late 90s, a trucker was driving home from Central Texas to Laredo, heading out early in the morning around 4 or 5. He'd just come off several days of rest at home, so there was no exhaustion clouding his focus. He was alert, cruising along one of those two-lane winding roads in the middle of nowhere when something caught his eye at the edge of his high beams. At first, he assumed it was the usual roadkill, a common sight on those long, desolate roads. As he got closer though, he realized it was more than just a roadkill. There was something crouching over the carcass, seemingly pulling something from it. His first thought was that the person might be collecting antlers as a trophy, but something about the scene felt off. The figure wasn't just crouching, but it was eating the deer. What he saw next made his blood run cold. The figure was tearing chunks of meat from the deer's stomach and bringing them to its face. As this truck drew nearer, the figure froze and looked up, directly at him. Not at the truck, but at him, locking eyes through the windshield. The creature then stood up, revealing its full height, and that's when the true nature of what he was witnessing hit him. It wasn't human. The thing was massive, covered in brown hair, and standing on the narrow shoulder of the road. Whatever this thing was, it was huge, far bigger than anything he'd ever seen before. His foot hit the gas, no hesitation, trying to get as far away as possible. As he passed by, the creature continued staring, not at the truck, but directly at him through the driver's side windshield. It knew he was inside, aware of where the driver sat. Even as he sped past, the creature's head remained visible above the hood of his truck. This was no ordinary truck either, it was an old needle-nose P, a tall, long-hooded truck known for its height and how hard it was to see around. Yet this thing's head easily towered above the hood. What stood out the most was the creature's eyes. Despite everything terrifying about the scene, what truly shook him was the intelligence he saw in its gaze. This was not an animal acting on instinct, it was something else, something that understood far more than it should. The memory of those eyes stayed with him, haunting him for years. It scared him in a way that little else ever had.